Welcome to the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Wall. I'm an RDH and founder of Inspired Hygiene. For over 20 years, we've had the unique opportunity to see what really happens inside thousands of dental hygiene ops and what it takes to create transformational change that impacts the lives of patients, practice owners, and teams. Each season, we'll focus on one powerful topic, breaking it down with practical strategies, real stories, and tools you can use right away. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. I am very excited. I think I say that every episode, but it's because our guests are so amazing. So I'm really excited to have Perrin DesPortes join me. Perrin, thanks for being here and taking some time out of your day.
It's my pleasure, Rachel. I've really been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and it goes without saying that I'm a huge fan of you and the work that you've done. I've seen a lot of it up close and personal, so this ought to be a good conversation for your audience, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. And the feeling is mutual. Perrin and I have been personal and professional friends for a very long time. And so, Perrin, you have really been deeply entrenched into the business side of dentistry. And you know so much about kind of all of the different workings with I will say, the growth of the group practice model within dentistry. You're very experienced with regards to, that distributor business from your time at Patterson and the relationships with all of the companies that support dentistry. Like, there's just so much uh, in our industry that the typical clinician is not even aware of, and myself included. And even though I've had the chance to dive into some of that, I still, know it's only the tip of the iceberg. So, tell everybody a little bit about you and your experience in dentistry and what you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll try to be as brief as I can. So, really, I got my start in the industry working for Patterson at an early stage. My family actually owned a dental distribution business called Thompson Dental Company. It was started in 1899, and we sold the business to Patterson in April of 2002. I like to say not for financial gain necessarily, but due to poor equity transition reasons. So I learned a lot about ownership and governance of a family held business at an early stage. That being said, I was blessed to find a role at Patterson that I parlayed into about a 15-year career. I led 3 different businesses for the company, from Richmond, Virginia to the Metro New York, New Jersey branch to Charlotte over those 15 years. And I learned a lot about the way an enterprise publicly traded company operates and makes decisions and really thinks about leadership. I was the beneficiary of a number of people who took me under their wing as a mentor-mentee relationship and really invested in my professional development. And I grew a lot over those 15 years because Patterson gave us a lot of autonomy to run operations as best we saw fit. And that goes one of either two ways. You're either good at it or you're not. And I turned out to be pretty decent at it. A few of my branches won a handful of awards over those 15 years. And when I left the company in January of 2017, you can think that wasn't that long ago. We can think back about a decade ago, and you and I both know that the profession of dentistry was undergoing a wave of consolidation, and a lot of that was private equity driven. And so when I made the decision to leave the company, I launched a startup called Tusk Partners with a couple of industry partners. And Tusk Partners was a startup that focused on what we call strategic consulting, growth strategy consulting. How do you build a group practice? Buy or build practices, lead and govern, bring in associates into ownership ranks, and all that kind of fun stuff. And then if you reach some level of success and you want to transact it, who's the buyer for that? And it's usually a private equity type entity. So Tusk was part consulting, part transactional advisory. One of my co-founding partners and I left that business in March of 21 to launch Polaris Healthcare Partners, a competitor to Tusk. And I did that for the next 4 years and ended up rolling out of Polaris at the end of 2024 to launch my current venture, which is Next Level Executive. I am an executive coach in the space. I work with dentists that are usually in the 1 to 5 location. Most of them are 1 to 2 location, but these are successful entrepreneurs who happen to be dentists, and they own a very successful practice or maybe a handful of them, and they're wondering what's next, thus the name Next Level Executive. And
Mhm.
usually what you find is that when you create a level of success in a practice, and I say success like clinically and stable operations and cash flows and everything, you have a lot of opportunities, and some of that can be to, bring in an associate who becomes a partner. Some of it could be to add an additional location, but you're starting to build a business that's not dependent upon you, and that makes a shift from what I would call, clinical focus or clinical leadership into more of an executive role. And how do you build a business that complements the life you want to lead? So I absolutely love the space. I think it's the perfect time for it. I'm very bullish on the emerging group practice space, and I think the private equity backed DSO space is in a state of chaos and turmoil, which we can talk about, if you'd like at some point. I have my
Mhm.
opinions on that as well. But
Mhm.
Next Level Executive focuses on the emerging group practice space,
Mhm.
and I teach people how to run a better business.
And a group practice could be one location with 5 dentists and 15 hygienists, right? That is a group practice. Uh,
100%. I
yeah,
love I love the all under one roof model. I've got a
yeah,
couple of them in the program that are 16 to 20 operatories, and
yep.
if you think about it from a headcount standpoint, from a clinical services mix, from a number of associates, from a number of operatories, that thing looks more like 3 or 4 practices in one instead of just
Mhm,
truly one location. So, yeah,
mhm.
love it.
Interesting. So the reason why I brought you on, other than I just really enjoy hearing your insight on leadership and just the industry in general, is that this is the first element within our inspired hygiene system, which is our framework for how we help our clients get results. And any type of shift, um, any type of evolution in the practice with regards to clinical services or, changing or integrating technology or anything like that always starts with the leadership conversation. And it always leadership really is the backbone of how successful that effort is going to be. If the dentist just says, "Hey, we're going to do this," and it just kind of is thrown at everybody, and there's not really a strategy or a plan of how to support the team in integrating it, it typically doesn't go very well. So this leadership conversation is really, really critical before leaders decide to, work with inspired hygiene or, decide to integrate, digital AI radiography analysis, anything like that is like, okay, where are we on a leadership standpoint point. And as we were prepping for this, I think a lot of the leadership conversations that happen in dentistry are about what I call the business side of leadership. So it's like, how are you leading your team? What's the culture you're creating? Do you understand your financials? And how do you communicate that to the team? But there's a whole nother element, and we've seen it go really well, and we've seen when it's not there, things really backfire, is the clinical leadership piece. So, as you've been working with so many groups over the years, and now with these emerging, leaders and dental executives that are dentists moving into this more of a role of the executive and the leader, um, what's the difference between, in your mind, business leadership and clinical leadership within a dental practice or practices?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. And let me maybe preface my answer just from the start by saying this, that if you and I go on Amazon.com and we type in leadership under the books search, it's going to return like 10 million hits or something like that. And
Mhm,
if you go on a podcast platform and type in leadership, it's probably an equal number. People throw around the word leadership and kind of shoot from the hip. Um, and it gets watered down, in my opinion, a lot.
mm,
And it's really unfortunate because leadership makes or breaks an organization. And you really can't underscore it enough. Yet there's so many people who talk about it, and it's non-specific, or it's just generic, and it's recycled pablum
mhm,
from what they heard on another show. I think there let me give some high-end concepts, and then let's dive into tactics around this because I think it's super important, and I have my opinions. So the first thing is for a lot of your audience who are dentists who own practices, they have probably invested a lot of time, money, effort, resources in their own clinical skill development. They can do a lot of complicated dentistry, right? And that is their craft. That's why they were at the top of their undergraduate class and why they went to the best dental school and they passed the dental boards and why their practice is successful. And when you focus on that, it's within your wheelhouse. It's who you are and it's what you do. And at a practice level, you also know that if you get into trouble, if you make a mistake or something goes wrong, you can outwork your problems.
Mm.
You can open up another Friday, do some
Mhm.
complicated cases, stay a little bit later, generate enough cash flow, and make the problem go away, right? That works against you when you're building a bigger business that's
Mm.
not dependent upon you. What you have to embrace is that when you start building a bigger business that's not dependent upon you, there's a lot of freedom that comes with that. The downside is you can no longer outwork your problems.
Mhm.
You have to become a better leader. And the focus, the dollars, the effort, the time that you invested in your own clinical skill development, you owe it to yourself to invest in your own professional
Mm.
development. All right. And I'm not talking about clinical skill anymore. I'm talking
Mhm.
really about leadership and becoming a
Mhm.
more effective executive. And so when
Mhm.
I say the phrase effective executive, that has a wide ranging, application. Most fundamentally, an effective executive is able to create greater results through other people than what they could create on their own in the same amount of time.
Mhm.
Okay, creating greater results through other people than they could create on their own in the same or less time. And that principle of leadership means that we must embrace developing people, recruiting the right people. We're in the talent management game, whether we realize it or
Yes.
not. We have to invest time and effort in developing people, and the effort that we put into them has to create greater results than what we could do on our own. And when we do that, we create a lift that is impactful in any business. I don't care if it's a dental distribution business, if it's a
Mhm.
clinical services business, if it's a, auto repair shop, right?
Yeah.
It's the same principle of creating greater results through others. And so I find that the reason I wanted to preface this just on the outset is because I feel like too many people talk about leadership and they say that, well, if I know the metrics involved and I just hold
Mm.
people accountable, then I'm a good leader.
Mhm.
That's wrong. That's what being a manager is all about.
Mm.
Okay? So if you think that leadership is me making Rachel Wall deliver a metric driven outcome in a hygiene department or an operations department, you're only scratching the surface. That's what a manager does. A leader embraces that candidate's ability to do something and creates greater results through them. If you embrace that, you'll build a business that rewards you for a very long time.
Mhm.
And if you can't figure that out, you will create a mess. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, I've seen both. So
Mhm.
I didn't mean to like dodge your question in any way, but I think this is like a really critical point that people get wrong on the outset that needs to be explored.
No, I think I'm glad that you said all of that because you're right, is that term leadership gets thrown around a lot. In fact, that was really why I looked very specifically at particular guests for this element of this season of the podcast is because I didn't want it to just be the same leadership conversation that we've heard a million times, right? So all right. So if and that really goes both ways. So what you said is the leader should be able to invest in and develop others to create a result that's exponentially greater than what they could create on their own. And there are business elements of that in a dental business, and there are clinical elements of that in a dental business. And when you're a dentist owner of a business, you unless you designate someone else as the clinical leader and the team trusts that person as the clinical leader, unless you do that, you're it. So you may need to be the, the executive and, where, you can wear your suit one day a week, but the rest of the days you probably need to wear your scrubs, even if you're not physically seeing the patient. And that is a big task.
Yep. It,
Yeah,
it, it,
it's a big task.
it absolutely is. And so it's a great talking point because we think about a dental practice or a group from having a clinical component and an operational
Yeah,
component, if you will.
operational. Okay.
And this was the premise of your original question that I so artfully dodged 5 minutes ago. But so I think when you have a founder driven business, they do wear all the hats, at least at an early stage, and this personal transition from being a clinician who owns a practice into an entrepreneur who owns a business is not the same thing. And most are not equipped to navigate that evolution on their own. I've got I've got something on one of my websites that's the top 20 mistakes people make in building a group practice, and most of them are oriented at this type of transition. So let's talk about maybe two things that are, I think, super important, and we can go tactically on all this, but at least conceptually, when people want to migrate from being a clinician who owns a practice into an entrepreneur who owns a business, there are a couple of things they run into. The first thing is most leaders, whether it's a clinical services business or anything else, most leaders at an early stage of their career incorrectly assume that they have to know how to do every job in a business or else they're not qualified to lead it. All right. And once again, I would tell you that is categorically wrong. And I point to my early stage career when I was 31 years old. And I moved from Raleigh, where we got to know one another, to Richmond to take over the Richmond branch for Patterson. And an operating business for Patterson back in those days had what we call territory sales, which is like the sales reps that call on dentists every 2 weeks. Well, I didn't know the difference in impression material and composite. I couldn't do that job. They had equipment specialists, the capital equipment. Well, I didn't know the difference in, a vac pump and a compressor. One sucks and one blows. Other than that, I don't know how to plug one in. I didn't know anything about CAD CAM sales, which was the early stages of Serac back in the day. I didn't know how to be an operations manager in a Patterson branch. I didn't know how to work a customer service desk or collect accounts receivable. I didn't know how to be a service technician. I didn't know how to schedule service techs, and I didn't know how to take inventory of parts on the vans. Literally, there was nothing in that operating business that I knew how to do. And I was the youngest person in the branch by about 5 years, and I was the one who's supposed to be leading it. And so when you walk into a scenario where you know that the business does something that you don't know how to do, that you cannot step into and fix, move the person out of the way and do, you suffer something called imposter syndrome. I'm not worthy of leadership. How did I find myself here? I'm out of place. I'm going to fail. Welcome to being a leader. All right. And this is where you have to embrace that. I can't do the roles, so I got to figure out how to develop people, how to get more out of them, that I referenced in the first answer. And when you start to make that transition out of a clinical role and into more of an entrepreneurial or a leadership role, you have to embrace the fact that there are things, even in your own business, that you don't know how to do. And that should be expected. The other news that's the headline is, guess what? The bigger the business gets is the more complicated it gets, and the less you'll know about that as well. But it doesn't mean that you're that you shouldn't be in the role that you are. So I always go back to, when I work with people at an early stage of leadership development, I tell them basically three things they're responsible for. And you boil it down to its essence. And a leader picks people, communicates ideas, and allocates resources, usually in that order. Picks people, communicates ideas, and allocates resources. in that order. So when we build a business that we're no longer the lead clinician in or the only clinician in, we're in the talent management game, and you have to embrace that. So we are constantly looking, we're constantly interviewing, we're constantly buying coffee and having sandwiches with people that we think we might want to bring on our team. We might not have a seat for them right now, but one day we're going to work together, Rachel, and I'm really confident of that. You want everybody to want to be a part of the business you're creating.
Hmm.
And if yours is a growing business, you're going to add +1 headcounts a lot, or you're going to replace underperforming people on your team. You're in the talent management business. Second thing is communications. The best leaders communicate relentlessly. And I know that I did at an early stage, and that's sometimes one-on-one, it's sometimes via text or a video message, it's sometimes in a small group setting, it's sometimes in a company address. But you have to be comfortable at all different stages, and you have to be consistent in your communication with your team. And the last thing is allocating resources. Usually that's dollar investment, but it can also be time or team resources involved. But if you boil it all down, that's what you get paid to do, and that's where you make an impact on your business.
That is that's so actionable as well. And I see that so clearly in the dentists that we work with as clients and those that we speak to as prospective clients is, they'll say, I've got my hygienist is left and I need to hire somebody. And I said, well, where's your ad posted? What are you doing? Well, I haven't done that yet. So that's something that you should always have going on. And I learned that from you. That was really an aha for me when I saw you present at an event a couple of years ago, was always be recruiting. And I know that you were speaking about it from an associate standpoint, but it's true for every role in the practice. And what I tell them is always, and the larger your organization is and the more growth oriented your organization is, the more important that becomes. But really and truly, it's important now because of where we are with our staffing situation in dentistry. So, and you just tell your team, say, hey, you're going to see ads out periodically for team members because we always want to find great people. And if we don't have an existing role for them, we'll find a role. Or there's always things. It also, honestly, it may create a little less pressure for your team when they know that you're actually bringing in support and you're not just waiting and everything's hinging on this one hygienist, and if she moves, the whole ship goes down. Like, that doesn't bring comfort to anyone. So I think those three things are really actionable. Before, I know you want to comment on that, but before we do that, I want to make sure and say, and remind everybody that's listening that Perrin, you're the founder of the next level executive.com is your website.
Yeah.
And you have the top 20 mistakes. You mentioned that in passing here, but I want to make sure everybody goes to grab that. Whether you're planning to, grow to multiple locations or not, tell us a little bit about what's in that resource, and we'll link it in the show notes for those that are looking at growing or they want to grow their existing location.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, when somebody asks, like, what do you do? You're an executive coach and you got, 25 businesses or whatever represented in your coaching program, but what do y'all talk about? I'm like, well, good grief, go to the website. There's a lot in there. And so I said, fundamentally, I'm not here to talk people into building group practices because I've seen the problems that people create, and
Yeah.
the compromises they have to make. But it's important to navigate your growth journey proactively and not just follow the herd or follow your ego. And so, if you're gonna build a bigger business, I think there are a number of mistakes that people make along the way, and that I've seen from working as a consultant with a lot of them, and some that I've made candidly throughout my career that are applicable in this space. And so I just started inventorying them one day because I used to say, well, I already know the top 10 mistakes you're going to make. If you want to start at number one, feel free to, but if you'd rather, make some new mistakes with me, why don't we start at number 11? And that
Mhm.
seemed to reverberate with people. And then I started itemizing them, and I was like, there are a lot more than 10 that I've seen. Good grief. And it went to 15, then it went to 20. And I was like, all right, we can stop there, Perrin. I think you've made your point. So I just put them in a PDF that people can download. And the easier URL to remember is grouppractice.coach,
Okay.
grouppractice.coach. And you'll see at the top of it, I don't know, it says something like top 20 mistakes people make. Put in your first name, last name, email address, and you can download it. And there are 20 points on there with like the problem and the context of it, but it's intended to be really a thought-provoking piece
Mm.
for people who read it, like, okay, how much of this can I relate to, and what
Mhm.
might be around the corner that I haven't thought of yet. That, this stuff is not formulaic, but if you go into it alone or with blinders on, the questions you don't know to ask are the ones that will sink your ship. And that
Yeah.
was my intent with it.
Well, and what you all when you do that, I would encourage you to download that, and when Perrin keeps in touch with you, you'll also get regular emails about his podcast episodes, which is Next Level Executive Podcast, and it's fantastic.
Thank you.
And you share just really extremely thoughtful insight on, the I will say the toll that running a business takes on our lives. I
Yeah.
mean, if you've never done that, you really just don't know, and I think most of our listeners have. And for those that haven't owned the business that are listening to this, you've worked in a business that is owned by an entrepreneur, and so it takes a toll. It also can be an extremely exhilarating experience, an extremely exhausting experience, and an experience where you continually feel that imposter syndrome of like, do I even know what I'm doing here? So, okay, let's get back to the topic at hand, which is the clinical leadership piece. So, I know you're always very quick to say, hey, I'm not a clinician, but that's also um, I think that's a nod to what you said is like you can run a business and not know every single piece of, what it takes to run it. You can run a successful and impactful coaching business for dentists and not you're not going to sit down if they're out sick and pick up the handpiece, right? That's not the best use of your time by any means.
That's right.
So, but you've seen from all of the solo and group practices that you've had access to, it's kind of seeing the inner workings, and I have too, is what happens when, um, there's no clinical leadership there. And again, it's not easy to do both, and very often dentists are tasked with doing that. What have you seen that breaks when there's not a clear plan for clinically developing the team and being the one there's not a clear leader, meaning that clinician is holding the clinical philosophy for the whole organization. That is 100% necessary in my view. But what happens when it's not there, and what are some things that folks need to look out for that might be signs that that's missing or it needs strengthening?
Yeah. So I think the mistake that too many people make in the early stages of building a group practice or a larger footprint solo practice, when they start employing associate clinicians, um, is that they assume, or they have the perspective that I'm a dentist, you're a dentist, who am I to judge, right?
Mm,
Who am I to criticize your work? And look, I get it. I mean, there is some degree of self-awareness about that, but Dr. Andrew Mata has a great phrase about this, and you and I heard him say this in Atlanta a couple of weeks back in the chief clinical officer workshop that I put on. And he said that consistency dies at the foot of autonomy.
mhm.
Clinical
Yeah.
consistency dies at the foot of autonomy. So what does he mean by that? And let's just unpack it for a second, um, because I think it's brilliant in its straightforward simplicity, and it ought to reverberate with the clinicians in your audience. When we say that, who am I to judge? I'm a dentist and you're a dentist. That abdicates the responsibility of clinical philosophy and clinical standards. around overtreatment or undertreatment, and certainly clinical outcomes. Autonomy also comes into, well, I like this type of impression material and you like that, but we're both getting different results. So is it the
Mhm.
clinician or is it the material? And,
Mhm.
what's in the best interest of the patient? And I think what his philosophy is, and I'm not at all speaking for him, but if the goal is to raise the clinical standard and to be equivalent across the board in terms of clinical productivity and effective clinical effectiveness, we have to have some level of judgment across the board. And if we have some level of standards and judgment from a clinical perspective, then that translates further down the food chain into, well, who are we recruiting and how are we developing those people to meet those standards when it's done our way? If your website, if you're a dentist and Dr. Rachel Wall's website says, we believe in comprehensive dentistry. And if Dr. Perrin DesPortes has a website that says we believe in comprehensive dentistry, what the heck is the difference,
Right.
right? And what does that actually mean?
Mhm.
I think the other piece to this that nobody really likes to talk about is that if you don't have a clinical philosophy, if you don't have standards and protocols, if you don't have consistency of materials or development plans or chart reviews and all of that kind of stuff, you open yourself up to a dramatic amount of liability.
Yes.
And this is the one that was a massive blind spot for too many people that I worked with.
Mhm.
And when I say I'm not credible enough to talk about this, this is the piece that I'm really talking about because I can't write a clinical philosophy. I am not a clinician, but I can darn sure tell you what happens when that goes wrong and there's a board complaint. And it may
Mhm.
be about one of your associates, but your name is on your
Yes.
license on the door of the business, your name is on the loan, okay? And you inherit a lot of that jeopardy unknowingly when you abdicate the responsibility of who am I to judge. And
Mhm.
I think you have to get comfortable with that level of saying, look, I believe in autonomy, but I also believe in standards. And here's the way we do
Mhm.
it in our business for the following reasons that are
Mhm.
grounded in reality.
Yeah. And I think you can have points of autonomy within the boundaries of those standards. And we can get into that more, I think, when we talk about in one of the upcoming episodes about calibration. That's another element of the inspired hygiene system, and that's exactly what we're talking about here, and I'll give you an example of how that works is, I remember way back in the early days of inspired hygiene, I was coaching a team up in the Northeast, and they had 5 doctors, and they had about 8 hygienists. And one of the goals of the doctor owners were we would like for our hygienists to be more consistent with teeing up restorative treatment for us, so that when we come in and, they do a consistent handoff. They've already taken a photo, they've communicated to the patient, what they see as a problem, and then the doctor makes the final diagnosis and recommending the treatment. I'm like, "Okay, great." So then I sit down to with the hygienists and they say, "Well, we would love to do that, but here's our practice model is every patient is a patient of all the doctors here, right? So they didn't have like, these are Dr. Desport's patients and these are Dr. Wall's patients. They're all our patients. And whatever doctor is free is the one that comes in and does the exam when we call for the exam, which is great because that means we don't typically have to wait. However, if you looked at one situation, Dr. A is going to treatment plan it like this. They're going to say, oh, we need to do full coverage crown. Dr. B is going to say, we're going to replace that MOD on that premolar with another MOD. Dr. C is going to do an onlay, and then Dr. D isn't going to do nothing. So, how can you expect the hygienists to tee up treatment when they don't even know who's coming in and they all have different treatment philosophies? And if you said, "Oh, okay, well, we'll determine who the doctor's going to be," so they know. So then you're asking them to do the mental gymnastics of educating the patient to a different treatment plan for the same problem every time? Like that just is not you're never going to get any type of consistency and traction there. You're always going to be frustrated. And it starts with the doctors. So my advice to them was like, I need you all to get in a room and do some case review and come together. And you don't have to be robots. That's not what I'm asking. But you've got to get on the same page with these three things. And then you must communicate that to your team if you want them to support you.
Yeah, and in an associate-driven type of a context too, when you have a clinical philosophy and you have a doctor development plan and you have standardization of materials to a certain degree, and you're diagnosing, you're all speaking from the same, playbook, so to speak.
Yeah.
For some reason, magically, the clinical performance of the team across the board goes up. And so when that happens, I'm not saying that everything has to be about the almighty dollar, but if you and I have a payroll to manage, it's a lot easier to do that when the business is performing at a high level.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, you know, i- when we think about the performance of the business, going back to some of the metrics we were talking about before, and how we get a lift in the revenue line across the board, this is an obvious way to do it. And it's also an obvious way to think about things like who's partnership material,
Mm.
or how do we think about associates into minority partner positions in the business and all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
it avails us of greater conversations to have that are more beneficial to everyone, including the
Mhm.
patient.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, you're just talking about continuity of care. I mean, how is that okay that the patient could be the patient of the practice and they could have a different treatment plan from every dentist in that practice? Talk
That's right.
about a board, claim, like, a patient could be complaining about another dentist in the same practice,
Yeah.
and then now you like, that's not gonna go well, and and what it does too, when everyone's on the same page clinically, is it gives the team confidence. There's always that element of the team when there's a new associate that comes in, like they're checking them out for a while. Are you going to meet the standards of, our senior doctor? We believe in our senior doctor and their clinical skills and what they're able to achieve and accomplish with patients. We're confident in their ability to connect with patients and be respectful of us and support us. And so when there's a development plan for associates that really the clinical leader is communicating those things to them and saying, "Hey, you know, here are our standards," then that is going to shortcut that development of the confidence by the team. And
And
then the
it's just,
team.
I was gonna say it's super hard to judge someone as not meeting the standard when you don't have a standard.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that we run into that a lot with hygiene departments when there's never been a standard and then everyone feels judged. It's like, we're just looking at the basics here. Like, we were talking to a team recently and the hygienist said, "Well, we're doing so much more now, that we've not asked for a raise in a while," which fair, like it was time, but we're doing so much more now. And I was like, but what the more that you're doing was the basic standards that are expected of hygienists. So so what do we do about all those years where the basics weren't even happening? We're not gonna do anything because 'cause we're moving forward, right? And so that's just, kind of seeing that from that's where from an outside view is like, "But wait, there were so many years," and I am continually blown away, by dentists that haven't thought about the liability piece of it when there are no standards in place. And though, again, let's go back to, they don't step into a business where you have an HR director, a marketing advisor, an operations director, right? They're trying to do everything. And they're one or two people typically, and it's extremely difficult to do that. So I think that's where, Perrin, you're so great at helping entrepreneurs develop themselves as operational leaders, as executives, and then you bring in experts to talk about the clinical leadership piece. You referenced Dr. Andrew Mata, and at your recent working group, it was the Chief Clinical Officer working group event for your clients. Dr. Mata presented for 2 days, and it was all about operational consistency from a clinical standpoint.
Yeah,
And yeah.
I think, um, uh, again, I'm the beneficiary of a lot of this from having worked in a corporation early in my career. And there's levels above the role that I had far,
Mm-hmm.
but I was always able
Mm-hmm.
to look up the organization to see
Yep.
how you accomplish leadership at a greater level. And many of the people in your audience and mine, just they are the top of the food chain. They are
Yes.
the top of the org chart, when they buy the business, and they don't have that frame of reference. And what I typically hear is that somebody has a couple of needs or a couple of questions or something that they've got to solve in their business, and they join a coaching program like mine because they know they need to solve that. And when they get
Mm-hmm.
into the program, inevitably within about 4 to 6 weeks, I get this email from them saying, oh my God, I had no idea. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
joined for A, B, and C, and they're
Mm-hmm.
like, 23 other letters to the
Mm-hmm.
alphabet, and I had no clue to even ask these questions. And
Mm-hmm.
at that point, I'm like, okay, you're at the right place at this stage of your career, and you're in the right program, because
Mm-hmm.
now you're wide open to learning about all this, even if you're not going to apply it today. But you're
Yeah.
starting to get that breadth of experience and perspective that you would have never gained on your own.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Yeah.
ability to accelerate learning curves is critically important in
Yeah.
leadership.
That awareness, and I think that's why it's also so critical even for team members too to meet and see these team members learn from that. I mean, so many team members have worked in one practice, so they only have that perspective. And then when they are fortunate enough to have a coach or consultant in there, same thing happens. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even know we could do that, or we could have these types of systems in place so that we're all doing things the same way." So, thank you for having this conversation with me. I think this could go to multiple episodes, so we may be talking again around things. But thank you for sharing that perspective and just shedding some light on, what leadership really is. And I just want to reiterate that it's when we can develop others to create a result that's way more than what we could create on our own. And that is a really, I take that as a gift of something that I've been able to do in my life. And there is it feels heavy, I think, a lot of times, but there's a lot of joy that comes out of seeing individuals really like go beyond what they even thought was possible for themselves, personally and professionally. So I just encourage everybody to keep on that quest. And you're just a great mentor for that.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the kind words, and really have enjoyed our conversation, as I enjoy all of our conversation, whether they're on mic or not. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's a real privilege being with you, and thanks for the work you
Thank
do
you.
as well.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great day, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. We hope you got a ton of value and ideas and action steps that you can implement right away. If we can help you in any way to optimize your hygiene department, head on over to inspiredhygiene.com to book a discovery meeting with us. As always, stay inspired.